What's up everybody, it's Rafi from ZURB. We hope you're loving this series on Flexbox. Now last week we talked about the brand new XY grid and you learned how to use that. This week we're going to take it one step further and we're going to go into the grid frame, which allows you to create complex web app layouts with independent scrolling panels. It's really awesome, so let's check it out. Alright, so we're going to set up a grid frame using the Foundation XY grid. Now this allows us to do some really cool things. So we can make these independent scrolling panels inside the body, and we can also make them horizontal as well. But the main thing about the grid frame is that it's pinned to 100% of the viewport height and its full width. So what that means is that no matter how small or large I make my screen, the grid frame will stay pinned to the outer edges of the viewport. Now that's really cool because it's a lot harder to do that without the grid frame. On top of that, you can also create this like header and footer section, which as you can see here, they appear to be fixed position, but they're not actually fixed position. So as we're scrolling up and down through our independently scrolling panels, our header and footer are staying pinned to the top and bottom of the page. We don't have to use sticky positioning. We don't have to use fixed positioning. Flexbox allows us to do that, and the grid frame makes it really easy to do. So let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to build this entire layout from scratch and show you how it works. Okay, so we talked about in the last lesson about making vertical grids. So let's go ahead and make a vertical grid again, because that's what this is made of, and I'll explain what I mean here in a moment. Now, a lot of people ask how I type a class and then I hit tab and then it creates the div with the class inside of it. That is a plugin called Emmet, and I'm using Sublime Text here. So you can download that plugin and it allows you to do this. Okay, so we're going to start with our grid Y, which is our wrapper. So inside of this, we're going to create a couple cells, or 3 cells. So I'm going to create a cell with the shrink class. So if you remember from the last lesson, the shrink class will only take up the amount of space that is required for the content inside. And we're going to call this header. Header is just a custom class I'm making up right now. So don't worry about it, it's just a custom class. Okay, I'm going to call that header. Okay, so I'm going to make 2 more cells. The middle cell is going to be set to auto, and then the bottom cell is going to be set to shrink as well, because the footer should only take up the amount of height that it needs for the content. So I'm going to name these with classes just so it's clear what is happening here. They don't actually have any CSS attached to them. Okay, and then we'll rename our sections. Well, we'll actually put content in here in a bit. So this is going to be footer. So right now the header and the footer, they both have content. We don't have any content in the body cell, and that one is set to auto. So auto means that it's going to grow to the amount of available height that's left over. So the reason I'm saying height is because, again, we're using a grid Y, which is a vertical grid. Okay, so what makes this thing a grid frame is the grid frame class. So we're going to go ahead and add grid frame, and we're going to save that. Okay, so this is essentially all you need to create a grid frame layout with a header, a body, and a footer. Okay. We need to add a little bit of content in here, and then we'll hop over and see what this looks like. So let's add some content. I'm going to go ahead and add some lorem in there, and then I'm going to add an image. Let's make it really wide, and let's make it a little bit taller. All right. So we'll do that. We'll repeat these a few times. So I'm going to use Panini's repeat helper because I don't like copying and pasting and wasting time with that. Let's do 10 of those. And if you're not familiar with Panini, don't worry, we have a lesson series on that you can check out as well. All right, so I repeated this 10 times. Let's hop over to our demo. Okay, so this is the thing that we just built. Okay, so you can see that we have a header at the top and a footer at the bottom. And right now, the middle section is expanding to fill in the remaining space. So that's exactly what we want it to do. So that's the grid frame. Now, we need this thing to scroll in the middle. It's not scrolling right now. So let's make it scroll. Okay, so there's a concept of a cell block container and a cell block. Okay, so a cell block container is the parent of your scrolling container. So in this case, we're going to make the body the cell block container. So what this class does is make sure that the container inside of it can scroll, and it also makes sure that it scrolls in the right direction. So now we're going to put a wrapper around our content. So we're going to call this cell block Y. All right, so cell block Y, and then we'll paste that inside of it. So what we've added is cell block container on the parent of the scrolling container. So the parent of the scrolling container in this case is the cell that's set to auto. It's our body. Inside of that, just put another wrapper in there that's cell block Y. Okay, so cell block Y. So cell block is your actual scrolling content, and then Y is the direction that it's going to scroll in. We want this to scroll in the vertical direction. So we save that, we hop back over to our demo. Now we can see that this scrolls nicely, which is exactly what we wanted. So right there, in just a few lines of code, we've created a quote-unquote fixed header and fixed footer, and we have a scrolling body section. So if I was to just shrink this down so you can see how simple this markup is, I'll just show you. So we really just have one outer div, 1, 2, 3 inner divs. So that's it, 3 inner divs basically to create this entire layout. So it's very minimal markup, very simple and easy to use, and very powerful as well. So now we're going to take this one step further, and we're going to build out the rest of that layout that I showed you at the beginning. So let's hop back over to that and take a look. We're going to be adding a subheader section here that has 3 divs side by side, and they're actually grid cells. So we have 3 cells side by side. The middle cell actually has an overflow scrolling situation, which is nice. So we'll set that up as well. And then we have 2 independent scrolling panels. That means we need to have a nested grid here that splits this. It appears to be 4 columns and 8 columns wide for the second one. So let's go ahead and build that out. Okay, so we don't need this repeat helper here right now. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that. We're going to nest a grid. And we don't need this cell block Y either, because we're directly nesting a grid inside of this cell. So the way that we nest a grid is we'll actually do the grid X class, because we're going in the horizontal direction now. We want 2 side-by-side columns. All right, so we have our grid X, and now we're going to attach 2 cells inside of here. So we want the first cell on the left to be our sidebar. Let's say we're going to make that medium 4. Got to spell it right. So medium 4 cells wide. Okay, awesome. Now we could paste in our content with our repeat helper. I'm going to make this just a little bit narrower. Let's make it 600 by 600. And we'll fix that indentation. There we go. Now we're going to have our second cell that goes right next to the first one, and that one's going to take up the remaining 8 columns or cells. And we can actually set this to auto if we just want it to automatically size, which is something we covered in the last lesson. All right, so here we go. I'm going to save that. We're going to hop back over to our example and take a look at what we've created. Okay, so now you see that we have our layout set up the way we want it. We have our sidebar here, which is set up to be the width of 4 cells. And then this other container right next to it, which is a cell set to auto, is going to just take up the remaining width. So that is set up correctly, but it doesn't scroll. So now we need to set up the scrolling. So let's hop back over to our code. Now we already have cell block container on the body. So this is the wrapper for our nested grid. We're going to leave the cell block container there. And then on the individual cells themselves, we're going to add the cell block, and we're going to put that in the Y direction. So the cell block class, cell block dash Y in the Y direction. So now it's going to be a vertically scrolling panel. So once I do that, let's save it, hop back over, and now we have scrolling panels. So this is a really easy way to set up these scrolling panels. You don't have to go into the CSS and write a bunch of overflow auto and WebKit overflow scrolling. That's already built into the grid frame. So we have this set up now. We're going to go ahead and build out the header section so we can see how to make a horizontal scrolling area. So let's go ahead and do that. So up here we have our header, and then we have this container with an H1. So underneath that, let's go ahead and nest a grid in here. So we can nest the grid infinitely, which is no problem. But after a while it gets pretty ridiculous, so I wouldn't nest it too much. All right, so we have grid X, and then we're going to go cell. We're going to make the first one shrink. And maybe it's going to have a logo in it. All right, so we'll make our logo 150 by, let's say, 50. Cool. We'll put logo in the alt. All right, so now we're going to make 2 more cells. Okay, so the middle cell is actually going to be auto because I want it to grow to the available space. I'm going to put a menu in there actually. So let's go ahead and remove that. Okay, and then I'm going to have the last cell be shrink, and maybe I'll put an input in here. Okay, so we'll put a text input in here with a placeholder of search. Okay, so then if it's search, we'll make this input type search. Okay, great. So we have that set up, and now we just need to add content to our middle cell. Okay, so our middle cell is going to have a menu. So we'll do a UL with a class of menu. If you're familiar with Foundation, then you already would know this. And then we'll put a bunch of links in here. All right, so I'm gonna not have to type a bunch or like copy paste a bunch of links. So let's go ahead and just use Panini's repeat helper, which I love to use for prototyping these kind of things. And then we'll repeat it. Let's repeat it 30 times. Okay, so we need to do just one thing to make sure that this sets up correctly. Okay, so right now we have this container. It's growing to the available amount of space, which is nice. As you can see here, though, it looks like the links are going to wrap because they run out of room. So we actually want this to overflow and then scroll. So let's go ahead and set that up. Okay, so now we're going to make this thing overflow, scroll, and wrap. So we already have our header here, which is the cell that's wrapping this nested grid. So again, that one is going to get the class of cell block container. And again, that's going to allow the proper scrolling behavior for any of the nested grid cells. So we want this auto cell to overflow scroll. So we're going to add the cell block class to this. Okay. We don't need to add the X direction in this case. It should just work naturally this way. So we have cell block class, and one thing that we're going to need to do is for any type of overflow scrolling kind of section, the way that the browser works is it's going to need a width on the item that is going to actually scroll. So we're going to put a width on this UL. I'm just going to do it inline here so you can see what that looks like. And then of course we would actually do this in our CSS when we're actually building. So let's put a width on this UL, and what that's going to do is allow the browser to know how wide this thing is that's going to overflow. So I'm just going to do an inline style here, but of course we would actually put this in our CSS if we were really building. Just trying to show you how this sets up. So we're going to do 300 viewport width. So that's 300 VW. So if we save that, hop back over to our example, and now we have a nice scrolling section of links. Now this is a really common pattern that you would use actually. So you might have a bunch of tabs that maybe if they do have overflow they would scroll. So this is a really nice easy way to set that up. Okay, so just a note on the responsiveness of the grid frame. The grid frame is great for setting up web application type layouts. So things like the Spotify app, things like your mail app where you might have multiple scrolling panels, and those are usually desktop size or maybe they're laptop size. And this can actually shrink down and work pretty well on maybe a tablet or an iPad. Now when it gets to a mobile device, you probably don't want to have independently scrolling panels like in the middle of your content section because you use your thumb to scroll the website up and down. So the grid frame actually has some responsive behavior built in. So I'm going to show you how to add those classes. That way you can actually use this on a mobile device as like a regular website. Okay, so looking back at the original example that we built, we have the medium prefix in front of grid frame. So you can actually specify which breakpoint you want this to begin being a grid frame, which is really cool. You can also do that for the cell block container, which we recommend you do. So medium cell block container. That means on small it will not have an independently scrolling section, which is preferable. And of course on our body section we also want to make sure that that's a medium cell block container. And you can also use the responsive breakpoints for your grid sizing. So medium-auto will set up your body to only be auto on medium. So this is actually going to make sure that when we're scrolling this, now you can see we're on a small breakpoint, that we can actually get to the footer at the bottom. We can scroll the body and then the stuff at the top of the header and the navigation. Those things stay at the top like they should. So this is how you can make the grid frame responsive. All right, so this is just a really basic example how you can quickly build a grid frame with the XY grid, make all these kind of independent scrolling panels. It's really going to help you set up your web apps a lot faster. So this is a really cool, powerful tool that you now have in your toolbox. So that's it. You just set up a really awesome web app layout with independent scrolling panels in just a few lines of code. It's pretty amazing. So next week, we're going to go into Foundation's Flexbox helper classes, which allow you to create custom components right in your HTML. It's really going to save you a lot of time. And don't want you to miss it, so make sure you hit subscribe up above. And every time you do, the Yeti gets a new frame for his self-portrait. So that's it for this week. We'll see you next week.